Tika Matos, I suppose a lot of that will have resonated with you in terms of the Elm City project. And as I understand it, in that case also, there was a real economic self-interest that was a driving force for starting the program, also, among other things, to reduce crime.
Sure. I should say I'm going to talk about the ID card, and this preceded my time at Atlantic. So this was during the period when I was deputy mayor of New Haven, working with Mayor John DeStefano. And from the city's perspective, New Haven is a mid-sized city. Population is about 126,000. The largest and fastest growing population in New Haven over the last decade has been the Latino population, with increasing numbers of undocumented Latinos coming to New Haven. And originally, the Latino population silently moved into New Haven, and they settled into one particular neighborhood where I live, Fairhaven. But as the numbers started growing, people started noticing that the demographics of New Haven were changing, and because people without status don't have the same set of rights and are often afraid to even affirm the rights that they have within the US, the city started noticing real public safety challenges that were facing the immigrant population. I'll give you an example. Things got so bad in the neighborhood I live in that immigrants started being called walking ATMs. Partly because of racial profiling of people in my community, anybody who looked like they were Mexican were automatic prey. And so people, especially on Thursdays when they knew that immigrants cashed their paychecks, they would go hunting for Mexicans so they could rob them and steal their money. So public safety was one concern. The other concern that the city had was one of immigration integration. We had a rapidly growing population and had real concerns about how we were going to be able to make sure that the immigrants in our community were a vital part of the city. We recognize that immigrants have historically contributed to the richness and the economic and cultural diversity of the city. And so we started meeting with immigrants, and one of the things that immigrants kept talking about was not just their feeling that they weren't being respected, but that they weren't recognized for who they were because they carried identification that was often not treated as valid identification. So one of the things that immigrants kept saying to us is, we need an ID. And if we have an ID, then we will be we'll feel much better about really becoming a part of the city, because we will no longer fear that when the police stops us and they ask us for ID, that we're immediately going to be identified as undocumented immigrants and be deported. We're not going to be afraid when we go to the bank to open a bank account that people are going to reject us because we don't have a social security number. So what we ended up creating was what we call the Elm City resident card, and Elm City is a nickname for New Haven because it has so many elm trees. And this is a card that's issued by the city. I actually have one here, and I always put my finger over my date of birth because I'm so vain, but you guys can't see it anyway. And what this is a city-issued identification card, and what it has is your name, your address, your date of birth. We issue numbers so that people are able to use those numbers to open bank accounts, and we have 9 digits so they correspond to a social security number. It's also, so it's a basic ID card. You have to sign it, you have to take your photo. The uses of the ID card are really diverse, and part of the reason we did that is because we wanted to make sure that the ID card was also appealing to non-immigrants, because we didn't want this also to be an identifier for people without status. So this has a debit chip in the back. It can be used as a debit card. It can be used to pay parking meters. It can be used as a library card. This magnet strip allows you to use it at any public library in the city of New Haven. And it also gives you access to city services, as well as some of the recreational offerings that we have, like the beach and the golf course. Finally, there's a kid card. So for parents with kids, the back doesn't have a debit chip, but what it has is contact information, emergency information. And if your child has an allergy, you can list the child's allergy. We kept the cost of these cards low because we wanted to make sure they were affordable. So they cost $10 for adults and $5 for kids.
Tufail Chaudhry, you have done for the Open Society Institute a survey of 11 different Muslim communities in Europe. I'm wondering how many of 11 EU cities and the Muslim communities in those cities. I'm wondering how many of these cities share this kind of view of Stuttgart and New Haven regarding migrants as a positive, vibrant contribution to the city, as an opportunity rather than a burden.
I think part of the sort of methodology for the research was not just to focus on the city, but to focus on particular neighborhoods within the city. So in Berlin, we looked at Kreuzberg, in Paris, 18 Arrondissement, in London, Waltham Forest. And by focusing on those local areas where the municipality was working, we found that actually most of those local areas were very positive because they recognized that these were the very population that they were working with. They were part of the communities that they were serving. And so pretty much all of them were very positive about the diversity of those cities and used that as, saw that as a key asset that existed in the city and attracted people to those areas. And so in our survey, we surveyed both Muslims and non-Muslims living in the same neighborhoods. And one of the key attractions for non-Muslims living in those neighborhoods was the very diversity of those areas. That was the reason why they lived in those areas. And one city in particular stands out as having changed its kind of perception of its diversity and of minority. That's Leicester, because in the 1970s, Leicester was infamous for having taken out full-page ads in newspapers in East Africa telling people not to come to Leicester because it would be a terrible place to come to. And of course, the effect was that people thought, Leicester, that sounds interesting. And today, Leicester now markets itself on that very diversity, on the kind of huge ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity of the city. It's become a key marketing tool for the city in terms of attracting investors, in terms of attracting tourists and shoppers. So I think in all of those cities, you've seen diversity as being something that's seen as positive because we're looking at the local level. And it's also meant that social services are having to adapt and adjust to that diversity, but not just to the ethnic or religious diversity, but becoming much more sensitive and aware of the range of different ways communities and societies are diverse and being much more effective at delivering their services, whether it's in education or housing or health services.
I want to come back to the how and the what, but one more question as to the why. I know that the private sector also is coming around to the view of diversity as a source of innovation, as a source of productivity. Certainly, PricewaterhouseCoopers says it's committed to that. It's right on the website in bold print. Why? What's in it for PricewaterhouseCoopers?
First of all, I'd like to thank the organization that we are here. Just to say to Julia, the business is here, so I think that's a good step. It is very relevant for us. Just as a little bit of news, I don't know how many of you visited the PwC website lately, but it has been renewed. We have been rebranded, so the word PricewaterhouseCoopers does no longer exist. We are now called PwC. And with it, we have, instead of what we had in the past was a homogeneous one-color logo, we now have a multi-color logo. So just for starters, which I think fits our strategy, because our strategy is growth and social relevance. And so therefore, diversity for us is a no-brainer, because we don't consider it as a social thing. Of course, inclusiveness is very important. We don't see it as a capacity issue, but we see it as a quality, as a business issue. So I think that is the main point from our perspective. And what I like about this conference for me, I'm a little bit of a minority here, but where we have been coming from, so we are a professional service firm, which means we are very old-fashioned, conservative. So we first had to deal with the white, male, masculine person, to make that a little bit more balanced. The conversation here encourages me, inspires me, to also to use that to also get the balance in terms of ethnicity, because that is, for us, it is, very, very simple that we need to do it.